All right. Welcome everyone to the final day of Austin Design Week 2020. It's been such a great week, stacked with such good programming, and I couldn't be more excited to be able to kick off this event that we have for you this afternoon / evening / morning, depending on where you are. So I'm Katie. I'm part of the ADW team this year, and you can connect with us if you haven't been already through social media. Just make sure you're tagging us. And we also have a Slack community that is going to be alive and well as things wrap up after today. That's where you'll get a lot of information about how to access recordings and connect with any of the panelists and organizations that you've heard from throughout the week. So make sure to check out the Slack channel. Someone will be throwing that in our Zoom chat. One of our volunteers will be throwing that in our Zoom chat shortly. Make sure to have your Zoom chat open because other conversation and helpful resources will be thrown in there. And make sure you also have your to set to all panelists and attendees. It won't be set that way automatically. You have to manually do it. And that way you can share with everyone as you're chatting. With this being a webinar, you'll only be seeing and hearing from your panelists today. So the chat is where you can connect. And then lastly, we'd just like to thank our sponsors this year. It's definitely, we could not have done it without them. They've been so amazing. They've not only helped sponsor the event, but brought us some great programming and made 2020 a smash hit, in my humble opinion. So that's it. I'm happy to pass this off and get this great event started. I'm going to hand it over to Jasmine, and she'll take it from here.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Jasmine. I use they, them pronouns, and I'd like to do a quick image description of myself. I'm a person with light skin and dark hair in a bun, wearing glasses, wearing leaf earrings and a red top with black floral print and glasses. I think I already said that, and red lipstick. So it's really great to see all of y'all, or well, not see you, but know that you're there in the chat. And we are from a community initiative called Interfaces. Interfaces curates art programs, educational and performance-based art programs that feature marginalized people. We use idea consciousness. Those are our principles, and they stand for inclusivity or inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. We explore the intersections of art, community building, space making, and social justice. And part of the reason why Interfaces was founded, as we'll hear more from our founder, KB, who will be here in a couple of minutes. But part of the reason why KB founded Interfaces was because when they came to Austin as a marginalized artist, it was very hard for them to find spaces in which, as a Black trans person, they felt like they could show up as their full self. And so part of what we want to do today is talk about how we can create events that feel truly inclusive, diverse, equitable, and accessible to people. So yeah, Ileana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, so good. Hi everyone, my name is Ileana Bocanegra. I use they, them pronouns. An image description of me would entail a light-skinned person with long black hair, wearing gold hoops. Hey KB, how's it going? And a striped shirt that has a collar on it. So that's me. I'm the creative director at Interfaces. I'm looking forward to chatting with all of y'all. And I just actually want to just now pass it on to KB, who just got here, to talk a little bit more about the origin and let y'all some context.
What up, y'all? So sorry for my late appearance, just on the go. But I'm KB. My pronouns are they and them. I'm wearing like a very old school Ape Escape shirt that is like black with a yellow and orange and pink and blue kind of logo. And I have long hair and brown skin. So a little bit about me. I am the lead organizer of Interfaces. And I don't know, I moved to Austin in 2018. And one thing that I did, or one thing that I knew like more than anything at this point with like just moving to different places is like, I find myself to feel at home when I'm like connected with the arts community and connected with people that like look like me, have similar identities as me. So I don't know, I took it upon myself to go to like every single kind of art space that I could. My specific discipline is poetry. So I went to every single open mic, poetry slam, so on and so forth. And one thing that I noticed is like, yes, we live in a very vibrant art scene. And I feel really privileged to live in a place where like it's an art event happening almost every day. But are all of those art events for everyone? I don't necessarily know if that was the case. I found myself kind of like having to fragment myself in kind of different spaces where I'm like, okay, I can bring all of my Blackness into this space, but is my queerness going to be accepted? And I write about that because I can't like, extract my queerness from my Blackness, for example. Maybe queerness is okay in this space, but like maybe transness isn't, maybe Blackness isn't. So it was just a whole bunch of like halves, right? And like I don't want to ever like feel like I have to like break myself into pieces, right? So then that begat this idea for Interfaces where I was like, what would it look like if art spaces also cared about like inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility? So that begat this really big idea of Interfaces, and now we exist to, in all of the things that we do, support marginalized artists, diversifying, what Arts Austin even looks like. And we try to do that through what we call idea conscious arts programming. And by idea, we mean inclusive, diverse, equitable, and accessible. And what it means to be idea conscious to me, I guess I'm maybe getting ahead of myself, but like what it means to be idea conscious to me is to, I don't know, like someone walk into the door and feel like this event was made for them, like that we thought about them beforehand. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to be having this conversation with you all. And yeah, I also look forward to even learning. I feel like I learn all the time from Jasmine and Ileana.
Thanks. Okay, well, thank you, KB. We're gonna go into kind of posing this universal question. So like, we're gonna be talking about idea conscious, which is the principles that we use when programming and designing events. And our question for you is to interrogate what you believe idea conscious means to you, and then think about how you apply it in your design life. Think about how you apply it in your practical life, in your relationships, and then kind of like, if you want, you can email it to us. We'd love to be in community with you. Our email, I'll write it in the chat. And the structure of this panel is a conversation between the three of us. So we're gonna just be asking each other questions, and then we will open it up for y'all to ask us questions. There's also a Q&A field, so feel free to utilize that. I'll be taking care of that in the chat as well. So Katie, just to let you know that since you got in here kind of late. Okay, ready? So I have a question for you, KB. My question for you is, what is something that you wish you knew when you started organizing for marginalized communities that you either like hoped for, or like an obstacle that you saw, like that you thought, okay, maybe I'm gonna have to like hit that block eventually? And like, what's something that you still hope for marginalized communities that we design programs for?
Yeah, a thing that I maybe didn't know before doing this work with Interfaces is that it's one thing to have like a diversity statement, and it's one thing to like be like, in theory I agree with you, and in theory like I totally want you here, but like the practice element of that is like a whole nother skill that you have to acquire, and that you have to like be committed to continuing to acquire. So just like looking into accessibility, for instance, and like realizing, you know, talking to other organizers, like, yeah, we want to make our events accessible, but like it's too expensive or whatever, right? And then I'm looking at the prices, and for this, you know, like organization on a shoestring budget, I was like, yeah, you're right, it is expensive, but it's a thing that I care about. So how can I like finagle our budget to make space for access? How can I like make it very apparent in the language that I'm using, and like really get across that these things like matter to us? How do I show that in like, I don't know, our Instagram posts, like all of these kind of different elements of what it means, and trying to like move away from platitudes and move more towards like mobilization. Yeah, it's not a thing that I all the way knew, at least within the arts world, until starting this work with interfaces. But I think it's awesome. I don't know where we're kind of headed as an organization. I also, you know, have seen more organizations, at least recently, say like these, like, we support insert, you know, social movement because it's in the news, but it's like, it's a different thing to actually like show that in all of the things that you do. Like, do you have diverse leadership? Do you have diverse lineups of folks? If, you know, you are in visual art, if you are in, you know, video design, if you are in music, poetry, essay writing, so on and so forth, like, are the like people represented in your organization actually reflective of even like the city that you're in, you know? And really asking those questions and like reckoning with like possibly like missteps, you know, that you've made. I think I had to like get comfortable with apologizing, and also get comfortable with like not being an expert on something. Like, even though, you know, I'm speaking to you right now on this subject, I know that I don't know every single thing in the world because I don't have every single marginalization, right? It's really bold to say that like we're an organization focused on like marginalized people. But yeah, I don't know. I still think it's really important. So yeah, commitment to education and knowing that it's going to be like a process, right? Yeah, and definitely obstacles have been like money, because capitalism, and like also like the inequities that come with that kind of structure that we're in, like who gets to get this like education on like how to write a grant in order to get that money, who has the time in their schedule to like make for those kinds of things. I don't know, it's all a system, but I push, you know, within those containers. I'm always like, you know, this like cylinder, I feel like we're in a cylinder world, and I'm always just like, I'm kicking. Like, I'm gonna try to do my best with the constraints that I have.
To kind of like piggyback off that, like, this is some internal information about the organization that like audience members wouldn't know about, but like as organizers, the way that we communicate with each other is pretty intentional. And we had a conversation right when we began organizing about like addressing what was happening in the news and like talking about Black Lives Matter. And it was like a difficult conversation to have, but I think that if a conversation is difficult, it's probably the one that you need to be having. And we had to address like things that felt ugly, and we had to say it, and we had to learn how to apologize, and then seek to be better the next day. And I think that like that requires a lot of work, being vulnerable, which is an emotional like it's an emotional tool. Like, not everyone comes out knowing how to say I'm sorry in a meaningful way and be sincere about it. So I would say that's also a part of the work, and that's also part of organizing for community. And like KB shared this really great resource, and I seriously think about it every single day, but it's about intention versus impact. Because I think a lot of organizing also entails like, oh, I didn't intend to upset these folks when I didn't think of them in designing my event. But the impact of that says otherwise, so it doesn't really matter what you intended in the first place. And that's just kind of like my, I guess, thing on that. Jasmine, do you want to like ask any of us a question or
Yeah, I mean, I have
talk about?
I have a similar question, I'll ask a question to you, Ileana. So Ileana, you are our creative director, and I'm really interested to hear what you would say to graphic designers or video editors, people who do the similar work that you do, who may not fully believe that their work is relevant to the principles of inclusivity, diversity, accessibility, equity and accessibility. So what would you say to people who are like, oh, well, I just don't see how that's related?
So my background is in documentary filmmaking. So I went to school for, and then I learned graphic design and that later on because of like jobs that I had. And I just had a conversation with this guy who was kind of like a debate talking about how documentary is all about like in moments and like capturing stories as they happen, and just sort of like going with the flow, and that it's hard to be intentional and to think of boundaries or to like consider boundaries. And like in art, like films that like there's this I think there's this idea that like the way you capture something has to be spur of the moment, and that sometimes you have to like do things and then ask permission later, or don't, what is it, it's like don't ask permission, apologize later, it's like a phrase like that. And I'm just like, I'm not down for that kind of like interpersonal relationship style. I would say to folks, I would say like, why are you being a jerk? Like, why are you not wanting to consider or like empathize, right? Like if design is focused on human-centered design, right, and how we like utilize empathy and UX and all the other disciplines of design, why can we not apply the same kind of empathy for practical things in our life, you know? Yes, thank you, Jen. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. Yeah. I don't like that. I'm a person who's fucked up a lot. Like I'm a person who's learned and grown and understood what shame is and how to not be in shame so that I can be a better person. And I think if you want to be a person in community and like be considerate and thoughtful of other people, it just know it's like really hard, but also just know that worth it. It's really worth it to like be a human person with another person and collaborate in that way. um I don't know, that's kind of like all I have on that. It's just really hard. Like it's hard to come to a place with somebody and hear criticism that feels like it's attacking your character because of like things you might believe that maybe like haven't aged well, you know? This like collective awakening that we've all been having during quarantine. So I think like consent culture is part of design. I think consent culture is part of communication design for events, especially graphic design. And like when we started organizing, we realized that we had a need to bring on an accessibility director, which is why we sought out Jasmine. Um, we needed someone to help us. Like we could accurately say, we don't know enough about this, and it's not a good idea to keep organizing without someone to help us. It's like in film with like including like what is it, inclusion writers, to help you and guide you, but also be paying them equitably, you know, fairly, not just including them because it feels like the right thing to do. It's like, what's your intention? And then like, what's the impact, right? Like it full circle there. I have a question for you, Jasmine, about accessibility, and I like printed out I printed out my questions. So we talked about this a lot, and I think that, and I'm not certain, I don't want to generalize, but I have a feeling like when people hear accessibility, they think people in wheelchairs and they think ramps at the event. And I just personally don't think that is enough. And I don't think that there is even enough knowledge about the full spectrum of accessibility. So I want to pose to you a question, like, what are some things that folks do not consider about accessibility? And if you could host an event without any restrictions like money, what do you imagine that an accessible event would look like?
So I think one thing I want to say is I see accessibility as a process, not a destination, right? Accessibility is not a checklist that you have like all of these things and you check them off, right? There are things that are necessary to meet people's needs, but I think like it's really important for us when we're building events or designing things, right? That we're considering whose needs are going to be taken for granted and whose needs are valued in society, whose needs are not considered valuable, right? Whether through disability or through other marginalized identities, which is why I see access as, when I think of access, I don't think about necessarily like, oh, like what disability needs what, right? Like that's part of it. It can help you brainstorm things, right? But that's not the extent of it. It's what do people need when they come in, right? And that can also be, for example, like having gender neutral restrooms is an accessibility measure, right? And that's not something that's always like seen, you know, that's not always seen in like a disability lens, right? But it's also like there are queer disabled people too, right? So I think about that a lot. I also think about, you know, like I think a lot of people think that they may know a lot about accessibility or what people need, but haven't reached out to the people who have different needs, right? They just don't have enough knowledge about the kinds of things that people experience to be able to meet those needs. So I think, you know, even with wheelchair accessibility, right? Like there's corners cut all the time on that, because just because you have a ramp doesn't mean it's wide enough for a wheelchair to go through. Just because, you know, it's like all of the pathways have to be wide enough for a wheelchair to navigate through. And are you really thinking about that when you're planning your events? Are you seeing this from the perspective of someone who is in a wheelchair, not just being like, check off, check off, check off? Some things that I like, you know, think are really great accessibility measures that I wish, you know, were more common are like quiet rooms, things like that can help people with a lot of different kinds of like mental health stuff, intellectual disabilities, and people with chronic pain can just have a place to like calm down. And also like another thing about accessibility is that we talk about it for the most marginalized people or for disabled people, but it really benefits everyone, right? Because sometimes you just need to have a place to calm down, right? And whether or not you have disabilities or not. And so having a quiet room can be an essential part of accessibility for people with certain experiences, but it is also beneficial to a lot more people than you would think. So I think like, you know, like quiet rooms are a really good way to have accessibility. The things that you provide in that room could be really helpful. Like if you have a weighted blanket, that could be really helpful. If you have, you know, like toys for people to play with if they feel really anxious, right? If you have like coloring books, if you even just, you know, just like a space where people can access some resources and maybe take a break from an in-person event. There's also, you know, other things that are not always utilized, like seizure warnings, right? I don't know if anyone here has ever had a seizure, but let me tell you, it sucks. As someone who lives with like multiple disabilities in my life, it can be really hard for me to feel engaged with the wider art scene because I'm not always able to even get in the door. And would really love to, I don't know, I would really just love to see ways that we can help each other and brainstorm what needs we need to be centering, right? What needs we need to be considering. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. You can do research on disabilities. You can do research on like best practices. But you can also like reach out to the people who you know are coming to your event and be like, what do y'all need, right? Like if you could have something that would make this event more accessible for you, what do you need, right? Other things that could be helpful are like fluorescent lighting can cause headaches for a lot of people, can make spaces very inaccessible. But a lot of times people don't think about fluorescent lighting. Like content warnings can be really helpful for people with a wide range of different things, right? And I also think about how, you know, so a lot of my background is in social work and sort of similar fields. And I see access work and trauma work as very similar, right? Because when people come into the room, they're not just coming in, you know, like they're not just coming in a vacuum, right? When people come in, especially when they're marginalized and have all of these experiences that are based in the trauma of oppression, if they see that trauma replicated in a space, they will not feel safe and they will not come back, right? And so I see like, and that's true not just for, you know, like marginalized, like that's true for disabled people also. People will talk about the, you know, like all of the infrastructure you have to have for a disabled person to like navigate through, but then when we get in the door, we're still not included, right? And so it's like what kinds of, like, I think also it's also about considering like what are the spots that you can't perceive as well, right? Like what are the things that you don't know? And that's part of the reason that I really I really appreciate interfaces, because they recognized a need that they could not fulfill, right? And that's why they reached out to me. And they knew that if they wanted to get like better accessibility, that they needed to reach out to the people who were most impacted, which are disabled people, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I want to just like say out loud, we're about halfway through, y'all. If y'all have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A portion. We're getting like a lot of good questions, which is good, that I think we may answer in some of the couple questions that we're asking each other. But like, please feel free as we're talking if something comes up, because I know it's not always easy to like memorize things until the very end. Like, please put them in Q&A and we'll be happy to answer them. But I wanna pivot into a question for all of us, if that's cool. What steps do y'all think, Ileana and Jasmine, Arts and Design Austin needs to take in order to be idea conscious? And what does idea consciousness mean to you?
I'll go first, Jasmine. Okay, like it's kind of a little bit about what you said earlier, Jasmine, where you were like, are you talking to your friends and community and asking what they need? Like if you can utilize the tools that you've learned in design, like I do a lot of UX design, so I'm like, my context is surveying and qualitative surveying, so like interviews. I would like begin to track and interview the kinds of people who are attending your events and asking questions that might make you uncomfortable. Like, how did you feel at the last event that I had? Did you think that the event that I had posed a threat to, you know, like racism? Or did you feel like there was sexism at this event? Like, just opening yourself up to hearing those kinds of criticisms so that you can move in the right direction, and either like apologize for that and then do better, or internally work with your team. Idea consciousness means to me like an open-ended, I don't want to say constitution, but like, because it's not always written, although I feel like it would be helpful if you could keep it someplace, like a living document, because your commitments will change over time. And I know my commitments have changed over time in design. Our Instagram account includes image descriptions now. And we are learning all the time about how to write so that people with screen readers will still know what's going on our pages. So that's like new territory for me. I never thought that like I would be thinking about contrast in images and contrast for graphics as much as I do. Sometimes I think about how art can be inaccessible. Well, one, because academia is always so closely tied to it, but also because of like money, and how expensive art can be, just to like, I'm not talking about like collecting fine art, I'm talking about like producing it. And we just like don't make things accessible for each other, and like we don't have conversations that open the door for, like, we don't have conversations that are invitations to change and modify and redesign. Like, if it's been designed, then it can be redesigned. I think that kind of answers your question, KB. If I didn't get anything, or you have a question, audience, then put it in the Q&A.
Yeah, no, I even want to like add to that and say that like we have to start thinking about feedback as love. Like someone being comfortable and like trusting enough to tell you, like to give you feedback. Is a gift. Like that's how you get better. If you are just around a whole bunch of yes people, if you're around people that feel threatened or like that don't feel empowered to tell you like if something isn't working, then that's a problem. That means that you're maybe not like creating a brave space, like a space where people feel empowered to disagree with each other. And everyone can't possibly think the same. So like really start thinking of feedback as like a tool, as like you don't have to bend to every single piece of feedback that you get, right? But like feedback nonetheless is better than radio silence, like 100%. And then also I think I would add to that as like, really intentionally think about if you are making it very clear that like people can give you feedback. So like if you have surveys, you know, online, especially within digital world, that you can send out, if you have this information like readily accessible on your website, those are all like gestures to say like, hey, we actually want to hear from you. Are you posting it on your like feeds every now and then to be like, oh, we're like soliciting feedback for this, you know, new program that we just did, so on and so forth. So leaving a door open, and not just saying like contact me, you know, because that feels maybe too vague. And thinking really about like the process of doing idea work is the process of hearing from people. You don't actually know, you know, what your community needs if you're not listening to them. And being in community is like practicing interdependence, and practicing like talking to the people around you and like really relying on them in order for I don't know, for you to be okay and for your space to be like, you know, to uphold its mission. So really take those things, you know, as tokens of love. Like for real, disagreement is where we grow. I've never become a good person from like, you know, no one ever giving me feedback ever. That's how we stagnate, I would even say. So yeah, that's a big part of what idea consciousness is to me. What about you, Jasmine?
Yeah, I definitely want to back up the feedback part because I think, you know, like as a disabled person, and also the comment that says you should have options for anonymous and anonymous feedback. Yes, 100%, because not everyone is going to feel empowered to tell you what they really think if they have their name attached to it, right? So a really great way to get that real honest feedback is by having anonymous options. But I think, like, you know, as a disabled person who has gone to so many events that are not made for me, that are not accessible at all whatsoever, anytime, you know, you try and talk to event organizers about it, it's usually very defensive, right? And I understand that because as someone who is an event organizer, it is hard to like know what everyone needs. But I think like something that helps me in event organizing is knowing that you're going to mess up, right? Expecting that as an inevitability, right? Not as like, oh, I failed, right? Because it's like, if you like, you're never going to get better if you aren't challenged to grow in ways. I think also like one thing, especially in Austin that I think is important for us to think about is that, you know, like the arts community in Austin and idea principles, they don't exist in this vacuum. We really have to think about, you know, our wider context, like how much can we really make events accessible if our city is not accessible, right? Like how much can we really, you know, like be inclusive of people of color in a city that is not inclusive of people of color, right? And so I think that as arts organizers, as an art community, we have a stake, right? If we are invested in the futures of all artists, right, then that means that we have a stake in social justice, right? We have a stake in making a world in which people can make art equitably, right? And not just the people who have those resources. I think about, you know, like how do we view professionalism, and how does that change who is and who isn't allowed in the art scene, right? In various different art like scenes, right? What do we see as the standard, right? And why do we see that as the standard? Let's question that, right? And so I think, you know, like in order to build an art community that is centered in the artistic vision of all Austinites, we really have to consider whose needs are valued in our society and in our art communities. We need to really be thinking about getting feedback, not just from people who are coming, but considering why there aren't certain people in the room, right? I hear a lot of people say, oh, I don't want to make the things accessible, right? Because disabled people don't come. But the reason why disabled people don't come is because it's not accessible, right? And so like after a while of trying to go to inaccessible things, disabled people just stop going and they just stop trying, right? And when you do that, you're cutting yourself off to not just like, you're cutting yourself off to resources and community, because more than 20% of people in the US are disabled, right? And there's so many people who live on those intersections of not just being disabled, but being disabled or queer, or being disabled and a person of color, right? And if you're not thinking of those things too, like, is this event not just accessible for disabled people or people of color, but is this event accessible for queer disabled people? Is this event accessible for disabled people of color? Is this event accessible for et cetera, right? And so I think like, a lot of times we'll think about accessibility or inclusion in these silos, but we really need to be thinking of how they all connect, right? And I think a lot of us here on this panel have multiply marginalized identities, right? Like I am a person who is queer. I am a person who is biracial. I am a person who has many disabilities, both visible and hidden, right? And when I go into a room, I don't just bring one of those things with me, I bring them all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine.
I was gonna say maybe like one more question and then we do Q&As from the audience, if that's cool with y'all. What are some, because I love things like not just being panels, like I went to this panel, like I know everything now, but like what are some like tangible steps people can take from this talk to improve their arts and design for marginalized people?
I would say that the intersection of art and culture is looking at disability justice. Like I got really turned on to disability justice, honestly, because of my friendship with Jasmine. And I also watched this documentary on Netflix called Crip Camp, and they did a ton of panels all through the summer. And I just learned so much because I was like in conversation with people across the nation who were having really hard conversations, and also not afraid to like fuck up. I don't know if I can say like cuss word on here. And I don't know, I can't like stress enough that like you are going to mess up. Like you are going to offend someone. And I think that there's this like thing that's happening right now, where people are really afraid to do that because we have a lot of disagreeing, like tensions and polarizations are so high. So if you mess up, then like maybe you're outcasted or something. I want to like reel back from that and like allow people to grow and change, but at the same time be held to account by their community. And Sorry, I don't really know what I was going with that.
You're doing great. That was awesome. Thank you. Tangible steps. So I think I saw a question in the chat that said, like, how do you translate access to like the digital realm? I could say a lot about that. I'll probably like leave that for Jasmine, but a couple things that I'm thinking of off the top of my head is well, first, really taking a look, you know, inside of your organization and being like, oh, how could this be possibly perpetuating something, you know, non-inclusion? How could this possibly be perpetuating like not diversity? Do we have a admission fee? How could that possibly be like hindering to folks? Do we have like specific policies around how people can dress? How can that be hindering? Does the venue that we use not have a gender inclusive restroom? How can that be hindering? Like so on and so forth. Like doing some kind of like intentional looks. And then even in the digital realm, it's like, do we have like captioning services, you know, like on standby for anyone that may need those? Do we have ASL interpreters, which totally, you know, can still translate very well to like the digital realm? You know, do we have that like do we have funds that we could divert there? If we find, you know, some kind of hindrance to the idea work that we're trying to do we just accept that, or do we ask like what are some alternatives? Because I think that oftentimes like the work of idea consciousness is the work of creativity. Like you have to be like not just like ending the conversation at like, well, we can't do that and that's it. You know what I mean? Like we were even like right before quarantine looking at different venues that we could possibly do in-person stuff at. And this place was like, well, we have these stairs. And like, you know, in some instances people would be like, oh, okay, that's fine. And like that be the end of the conversation. But I was just like, well, can't we just like buy portable ramps? What is that, like $120 or something? We can find that in our budget and we could just do it, right? Do we have like a separate disability entrance than the main entrance? What message does that have, right? Can we change that, right? Okay, you have men's and women's restrooms. Can we just like put literally like paper on top of it and say anyone of any gender can use this restroom? Like it's the matter of being like creative, right? So I want people to like, I don't know, broaden their curiosity and broaden their creativity when it comes to doing this work, right? Yeah, and like I know money can be like really meticulous, especially for things like led by marginalized folks. We for sure don't have all of the money in the world and wish we did, but like what can you do? Like what can you do that maybe doesn't cost money or that costs really like low amount that like fits into your budget? So like thinking about those things. Yeah, I'll stop there. Jasmine, what about you? Tangible steps.
I think one of the best things that people can do is listen to the marginalized people who are already talking about this, because there are people who are talking about how to make things more inclusive, how to make things more accessible, and they may not be in the most reputable sources that you think of, because who has access to that, right? Usually people who are more privileged. I've learned a lot about accessibility and about inclusion by following people's social media accounts. I've learned a lot about accessibility and inclusion by reading blog posts, right? Because the thing is, like, a lot of the times the things that we actually need to be inclusive or accessible, marginalized people are not given as much space to speak about it in the settings that are more reputable. So you have to do the work of finding them. You have to do the work of finding them and meeting them where they're at. And people are already talking about this. People have entire like social media pages dedicated to disability education, dedicated to racial education, right? And so that's like a really good place to, because like, you know, you'll need a lot of like that technical knowledge and stuff like that. And you can find that in a like on Google a lot of times, but I think that there's something to be said about doing your research about the lived experiences of people, right? Because if you're trying to be inclusive, then you're trying to make space for their lived experience. And if you don't know anything about their lived experiences, right, then and yeah, another step, content warning. So like there's a lot of different things that you could do. There's like image descriptions for any visual material, interpretation and captioning makes things more accessible for deaf, hard of hearing people. It's ideal to have both of those things because not everyone who is hard of hearing can speak ASL or can sign ASL. And not everyone who and there's a lot of people who use captioning that it helps them, but they're not necessarily deaf or hard of hearing, right? There are people with auditory processing disorders and stuff like that. But also like ASL is a really big part of deaf culture, right? And so if you want to have that inclusive environment, right, then you really need to think about what it is that, like, what messages are you giving if you don't have an ASL interpreter, right? A lot of people who are going to be deaf or hard of hearing are not going to feel welcome, or they're not going to feel like their needs are centered, right? You need to have spaces for wheelchairs and walkers and people with canes to navigate through. Having armrest free seating makes things more accessible for people who are bigger, who are fat, right? Gender neutral restrooms, content warnings, seizure warnings. If you have food, making sure that you have options for people who have gluten allergies, who are like vegetarian or vegan, right? And I think like one thing that I like to think about in accessibility is that generally the more options you have, the more likely you are to be accessible, right? Because the thing is, there is no one size fits all for accessibility and for providing accessibility, because everyone's bodies and everyone's minds and everyone's needs are different. So the more options you have, the more likely you are to cover different people's needs.
Thank you so much, both of y'all, for those answers. Now I think we can migrate, whatever the word is, to these Q&As here. So, I also should say, this is like 1 hour, right? Which means we couldn't possibly say every single thing that we know ever. If you want to even like have us on a contractual or consulting basis to come into your organization and tell you kind of like the things that we've learned through our organizing, we're more than happy to listen to those inquiries. Please just email us at atxinterfaces@gmail.com. But moving on to these questions. So first things first, how would accessibility translate into digital events? I feel like we more or less said this, but to reiterate, definitely captioning, definitely ASL interpretation translates well to the digital realm. Definitely also the like auditory description that we did at the beginning. Definitely, if you're going to show any images, having image descriptions for that. Google Slides even has like a pretty cool like plugin to where it can like live translate like what you're saying if you're like showing a slideshow. So things like that could be cool. Do y'all have any other ones, Ileana, Jasmine?
I was just gonna say on Instagram, including image descriptions as well. And there's also a lot of resources that I like Googled about, like if you're using Squarespace sites, like they will tell you what you can do on the back end and in settings, probably for Wix too, or if you're programming it yourself, on like how to make things more accessible for screen readers. Like sometimes we include images and like it gets all sloppy with the code, but like there are ways around that so that it's more accessible to those people.
Yeah, I think I would add something that can be helpful sometimes is having like a slide with material. If you're giving like some sort of like presentation, sometimes that can be helpful so that people can follow along visually as well. When in registering for the event, if you ask all participants who register for the event, what are your access needs? That's a really good way to like gauge things beforehand that maybe you wouldn't have ever been able to think about before. Having content warnings and seizure warnings are still relevant to the online space. There are some things that like, and I think, I think one thing that we really need to think about with accessibility is accessibility and the measures we take for accessibility are only as good as like people know about them, right? So like one thing that you can say that can make things more accessible, even though like it is possible people could just do this whenever, right? But you could say like, you can mute yourself or leave at any time. You can turn off your video at any time, right? When you say that explicitly, right? Even though people like could technically do that, it increases that access and inclusion because now people know that like that is explicitly allowed, right? And when you have like, and so, it's a lot of the same process as in-person events. You're just keeping in mind the format of online, right? It's like, what needs does this format not help with, right? What do we need to do to make this accessible to people who aren't going to be able to hear it, right? Or who aren't going to be able to see it? And there are some needs that we don't need to think about as much, right? Like wheelchair accessibility, because it's online, right? So it's like we're not in charge of the physical space, but you're still sort of thinking through that process, right? What are the needs that people are coming in with? And how can we address those? And how do we figure out who cannot come? And how do we express to people, not just in our event, but through our marketing, what kinds of accessibility measures will be available? I think it's a really good idea to have an access statement for every single event, because a lot of times disabled people aren't going to show up even if you are accessible because they don't know if you're accessible, right? So if you make an effort beforehand, not just with in-person events, but with digital events, saying like ASL will be provided, captioning will be provided. And then for in-person events being like, you know, this is what we have in the space, right? Because that way disabled people can make their own choices, right? About whether or not it is accessible for them, right? And not every event is going to be accessible for everyone depending on its purpose, right? Like if you have like a poetry reading or something that's very, very loud, maybe that's just not going to be accessible for some people, but at least if they know what to expect, they can know whether or not they show up or not.
I want to say one more thing. It's like, well, sorry, now I'm forgetting. Never mind. I need like 2 seconds.
All good, all good. We can ping back to you. I'll go to another question in the meantime. Are there things that we can do to make people feel more comfortable in our space if we're a venue that requires that we have police present at events for safety and security? So there's no doubt that the rest of the world, marginalized people have known this for a while, especially Black folks. I will say there's this like awakening that's happening that's like, oh, police does not increase safety. Police do not like make everyone feel like safe. I personally have never felt safe. Like if I see a police officer there, I'm probably like getting spiked anxiety. So I would say, I don't know, having police present or like is a access kind of barrier even, especially for communities of color, especially for LGBTQIA plus people, especially for just like marginalized people in general. So that's just a thing that like I hope that we're all on the same page about. But anyway, I mean, even talk to the venue. I mean, like, can we have an open dialogue about like what public safety means to us as a venue and like how we can ensure safety and the repercussions or like the signaling that police officers, especially armed ones, like bring to the venue? Like, can we talk about that? Is that a thing that you're not gonna budge on? If it's not, I would even say like, do you have the resources? Do you have, I don't know, are you equipped to like move venues? Cause I don't know that it would be like a thing that people could look past. Like you may just like not have a specific kind of group of folks if police are present.
I would also add too that like, you know, and it's like, I think there's a lot of stuff in the news happening about how police presence is not helpful for a lot of communities of color, especially Black people. But also consider that like there are a lot of communities that do not have a good relationship with the police, including disabled communities, right? A half to 2/3 of people who are killed by the police are disabled, right? So when you have that police presence, it doesn't just make things inaccessible for like one group of people, it makes it inaccessible for a lot more people than you might think. And if there are ways to, like, as KB was saying, not engage in that or to cut that down as much as possible, then I would do that.
Yeah, I would just say like, what are your public safety measures outside of policing? Because we know that public safety does not, like policing is not synonymous with public safety. And if safety really is the concern, then like we can address safety and we can have a safety plan as a venue and as a like initiative, but does it have to include police? Like, I think strong communities really make police obsolete, you know? And I think that contingency plans that don't rely on violence or like rely on that kind of like, I don't know, I could say a lot, but I will say that I think that we have to think about public safety as not just like synonymous with policing. And if your venue is open to that, I really hope that you can open that dialogue.
If you're, I was gonna say, if you're interested in like carceral state stuff. Like we actually have a zine coming out really soon where we got submissions from community, and that's coming out like in a few days or like a week from now. We'll be doing orders off of our website, and you can purchase one of those zines. We talk a lot about, and there's resources in there as well. I remember my tangible thought, just for like the last minute that we have. My tangible thought is that, like, begin to have the conversations, and you can write down, like, so I had questions that I thought might offend people. I had questions that I thought, like, wow, I can't believe I don't know the answer to this, or like I've been Googling things and there's just not not a lot that I'm getting to, like, on Reddit and stuff. And so like, sometimes you have to be a little bit meta in your conversations and say, like, give an expectation, like, hey, I want to have a conversation with you about this. It's going to entail this. Like, those are all the content warnings that you can give prior. And you can also say, like, do you have the space to hear this? Like, asking yourself, am I in integrity with my community if I don't know these things beforehand, or if I need to, like, access this other thing? Who can I talk to about that? Sometimes people are gonna be like, no, I can't open that can with you, but maybe this person can, or best of luck. And that's okay. You can take that with you and try again. There's nothing wrong with that.
Thank you.
Just
Thank
like
you.
not being a jerk, you know.
So I think two people asked the same question, which is like, what are some social media pages we can follow to learn more about accessibility and inclusion? Please email us, because out of the interest of time, we don't want to go over. And we can definitely send you some recs hot off the press from Jasmine. But thank y'all so much, for having us. We really appreciate it. Hopefully, you got something from this session, and this, like, propels you into, like, learning more about this. Again, if you are interested in interfaces, please follow us, ATX_interfaces, literally everywhere. Also, if you want to do some, like, consulting work with us, please email us, atxinterfaces@gmail.com, and we'll be more than happy to, like, kind of speak with you and get you to a place that is idea conscious. Does anyone else have anything else before we adjourn?
It was really great to be here, y'all. I really hope y'all check us out. The shameless plug. We have cool events and cool zines and stuff like that. And it was really great to be here. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.